Baltimore VA Medical Center and at MRC. I work in both of their emergency departments. Hopefully I never see any of you in a professional capacity, but if any of you happen to be at those ERs and I happen to be working, please feel free to come up, say hi, say, oh, you're the guy who gave us that really awesome training that one time. And I guess if you don't like it today, then don't say hi. But today, though, on a more serious note, I want to talk to you about a topic that, has been an interest of mine, and unfortunately is something that I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of in the coming months, and it may be obvious why that is. But the topic today is when the protester becomes the patient. When protests kind of turn violent, when there are injuries, how do we, in the medical field and the emergency management field, how do we respond? This is something that certainly those of us in the medical field will need to know. And these are events that, potentially as Maryland Respond members, we could be called on to assist with. So a very important topic. Unfortunately, I think a very timely topic, and something that hopefully, at the end of this, all of you will have some greater familiarity with.
Dr. Jasani, we lost your feed. Just as a note, please don't record this on your own. It's going to take away from his presentation. He is presenting, and we will take care of recording everything for you and making it available. Thank you.
Yep. Did I come back, Karen? Can you guys see me again? Hear me?
I see your face, but I don't see your presentation.
Uh-oh. Hang on. I'm going to try resharing. My apologies.
No problem. It's not you.
All right, let's try that. And then, can you see it again? Maybe.
No.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yep, we have it.
I now see a presentation.
All right, we do have it. Thank you very much. If
Cool.
everybody could go ahead and mute yourselves again. Thank you so much.
Did the slide advance?
We're at objectives.
Perfect. All right. If you lose it again, please let me know, Karen, and we can troubleshoot. Objectives for this talk is I want to discuss some of the weapons that are commonly utilized during periods of protest. As kind of following that, I want us to understand the injury patterns caused by some of these weapons and what the medical treatment is for those who might be on the wrong end of some of these. And finally, I work in an emergency department. I imagine some of you guys on this call do as well. But I want to explore some of the security challenges posed to emergency departments. And again, whether you're in an emergency department, whether you're responding as part of Maryland Responds or some other organization, be it law enforcement, be it emergency management, be it health in some other capacity beyond an emergency department, these are challenges that, again, are fairly universal and are going to apply to all of us who are working during a period of protest. So look, to protest is American, right? Our nation was founded really in large part due to protests. So as I'm sure many of you know, this is a painting of the Boston Tea Party, kind of in the run up to the American Revolutionary War. The colonists at the time were disgruntled that the British were imposing taxes on them. A bunch of Bostonians decided that the way to express their displeasure was to pour a bunch of British tea into Boston Harbor. And, kind of as a result of that and some other events, our nation was born. And we've really, as a nation, taken great steps to ensure that our citizens have a right not just to express themselves, in the press, but also to gather, to demonstrate, fairly freely. This was something that was enshrined, in our Constitution, in our Bill of Rights, and really as a result of the way that our nation was formed. Unfortunately, protests can have a propensity to turn violent. This is a painting around the same time of the Boston Massacre. Same thing, a protest, some British soldiers, for one reason or another, opened fire into the crowds. And as you can see, there were casualties as a result. I know protests can be peaceful. Many have been throughout our nation's history. Unfortunately, even peaceful protests can result in injuries, and certainly protests that turn violent can certainly result in significant amount of casualties as well. So what is a civil disturbance or a protest? Well, our partners in the Maryland Capitol Police have this definition. Civil disturbance is an unlawful assembly that really presents some sort of danger to others or to property. I'm paraphrasing that definition a bit. Protests can be peaceful and protests can be violent. Violent protest is when we start using terms like civil disturbance, civil unrest, civil disorder. Those terms are fairly synonymous. They're used interchangeably. Or just be aware if you hear the term civil disturbance, civil unrest, those terms kind of mean the same thing for all intents and purposes. What are some of the causes of protests? I think some of these are fairly intuitive. Over the past few years, we've seen a lot of protests kind of around social justice issues. I'm sure most, if not all of us on this call, remember the nationwide protests we saw around Black Lives Matter in the aftermath of George Floyd's death in, I believe, 2021. It might have been 2020. But again, national protests that kind of were sparked by this social justice issue. We've seen political unrest, perhaps best personified in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021. But again, seeing political violence on all sides, or maybe not political violence, political unrest on all sides that sometimes has manifested itself in protest. But it doesn't have to be, these big social justice movements or even political movements to cause protest. There's sometimes more seemingly trivial things that can cause it. This is a picture from a music festival, and I believe it was either Ontario or Vancouver. I can't remember. In the 1990s, there was a large group there who had gathered to see a concert. For whatever reason, the main act had to cancel, and the people were very upset about that, as you can see, and began smashing things, looting, and again, just generally causing mayhem. So certainly entertainment events, anytime you have a large gathering for a specific event, that certainly can turn violent. We've also seen protests in response, or civil disturbance in response to sports, teams that have either won or lost, and fan bases that are very passionate about that. We're all Marylanders here. The Orioles, despite their recent slump, have been doing well this season. Hopefully there's a good postseason run in it for them this year. But again, who knows, depending on how their postseason run goes, depending on how far they make it, that can certainly be an impetus for civil unrest as well. And I don't know about any of you on this call, but I feel like every time I turn on the news, listen to the radio, whatever, this is how I feel. I feel like we as the world are on a metaphorical cliff, a precipitous edge, and it's not going to take much to kind of push us over that edge. Perhaps as a result, we're seeing more civil unrest, both domestically and around the world. This graph shows that, as you can see, civil unrest, both demonstrations that are peaceful and demonstrations that have turned violent, are on the rise globally and have been for the past decade or so. Maybe more concerningly, closer to home, this is a graph of individuals who feel that violence is justified in advancing political goals. As you can see, this has shown a sharp uptick in recent years, and it cuts fairly evenly across the political aisles. Both Democrats and Republicans are seeing larger numbers of their rank and file, so to speak, who feel that violence is justified in advancing some sort of political end. And again, how real is this threat? Well, the Department of Homeland Security, in their annual threat assessment, wrote that, and I'm quoting this here, "We expect the 2024 election cycle will be a key event for possible violence." That's pretty strong terms for the Department of Homeland Security to say about a domestic election. An election that, by the way, we are going to see the first debate of tonight. Again, in the run up to this, in the next 6 months and the few months beyond, I personally am very concerned about what we are going to see from both sides of the aisle, depending on which way the election goes in terms of demonstrations, protests, and potentially even violence. But what is our role in healthcare and, as part of Maryland response? Listen, I have no doubt that everyone on this call has some very strong feelings about some of the issues that I've touched on as triggers for protests. I know I certainly do. When we're at work, though, we have to leave that at the door, so to speak. My role as an emergency medicine physician, all of our roles when we're, at our various jobs and within Maryland Response, isn't to take sides when people come to us seeking care. It is to provide everyone, regardless of their political persuasion, regardless of their thoughts on social justice issues, regardless of whatever sports team they do or don't cheer for, to provide them with the best possible care that we can. We might disagree with what they were doing before they walked through our doors to seek our help, but once they do, they are our patients, and they deserve the same rights and respects as we would give anyone else. It is fine to protest on your own time. I would ask that you do it peacefully if you do, but it's fine to do that. But again, once you're at work, once you're part of Maryland Responds, we have to check all that and work in a neutral way to provide the best possible care that we can. One note on that, before I get into the weapons that we're going to encounter, all of the weapons that I'm going to discuss in this lecture are weapons that law enforcement commonly utilizes against protesters. This isn't me trying to take a pro or anti-law enforcement stance. I'm not trying to make a statement one way or another. It's more just a reflection of the fact that law enforcement often uses some fairly unique modalities during this time that we don't often see at any other times. And so I want to discuss them so that we have some familiarity with them. Protesters, by and large, if they're going to put up some sort of resistance, they don't typically use unique weapon modalities. A lot of the stuff they'll use, whether it be throwing bricks, whether it be punches, hits, that stuff that we see every day. And I would hope a lot of us who work in emergency medicine and emergency focused healthcare feel fairly comfortable seeing and treating. So again, my focus will be on weapons law enforcement utilized, but again, that's not me trying to make a particular statement one way or another. So with that, let's move into some of the weapons that are commonly seen. And the first one I want to talk about are kinetic impact projectiles, KIPs for short. So these were initially developed by Britain in the 1970s. They were first deployed against the Irish, who were, many were calling for their independence and protesting on that, and these were first utilized against them. You've probably heard the term rubber bullets, beanbag rounds, sponge rounds. Well, that's what this includes. This is a picture of a beanbag round, both the beanbag round itself and the canister that it comes in to be deployed. It's a very popular, quote unquote, non-lethal option among law enforcement professionals during periods of unrest. And we'll talk about why that might be a bit misleading. So how are how are KIPs delivered? Well, they're fired out of this kind of tube looking thing on the left here, kind of a modified rifle. As you can see on the right, and this is a picture from the manufacturer's website about how it's supposed to be deployed, there's an ideal range, which is around 130 feet that the officer should maintain before utilizing it. And ideally, it's aimed at the torso or one of the limbs. That's the ideal. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. Law enforcement officers, for whatever reason, often are not able to maintain that 130-foot standoff distance when they're utilizing these weapons. Additionally, you can see this officer here has a number of rounds kind of on his person, in addition to presumably the one he's got in the chamber. These things don't always behave like normal projectiles. They're not metal like bullets are. A lot of them have some sort of foam or sponge component. They don't always have a predictable flight path. I don't know if anyone here has ever shot a Nerf gun, if they've ever been playing with their kids or siblings or whatever. I certainly have, and I can tell you that where you point the Nerf gun and where the Nerf dart ends up can sometimes be two very different places, and the same principle applies here. So again, unfortunately, law enforcement isn't always able to deploy these in the way that's recommended. The consequences of this are, as perhaps you can expect, some fairly serious injuries. These rounds impact with about twice the force of being punched by a professional boxer. So imagine Mike Tyson punching you and multiply that by 2. And that's the force with which these things are impacting individuals. Again, with the intent of kind of incapacitating someone so that they'll stop causing, mayhem on the streets. But again, when these things are hitting heads, necks, eyes, as you can see from some of the pictures here, the consequences can be fairly severe. These are all pictures from various protesters during the some of the Black Lives Matter protests. These are from different cities, but as you can see, all of them suffered some fairly significant injuries as a consequence of being hit by a kinetic impact projectile. There has actually been a study that looks at death and disability from people who have been injured from kinetic impact projectiles. About 3% of individuals who are hit by them actually end up dying. And about half of those were hit in the head. And you can see the top graph up here, the 53 number that says died, it's broken down where they were hit. Again, most of them are going to be hit in the head, are going to suffer some sort of internal bleeding or brain damage that's ultimately going to lead to them expiring. 15% of survivors suffered some sort of permanent disability, and that's the graph on the bottom, where they were hit and what kind of disability they suffered. The vast majority of those who suffered permanent disability were hit in the eye and had permanent blindness as a result. Again, imagine being punched in the face with twice the force of a professional boxer. If all of that force is directed at your eye, and if that's where it mainly impacts, it's going to cause a significant and potentially irreversible damage to your eye, and can unfortunately lead to blindness if that's where it ends up impacting. So again, while again, the vast majority of people who are struck by these don't die, it's only about 3% that do. These do have the potential to lead to some serious harm. And I would say, again, for those of you in emergency medicine, if you have someone who has been hit by these, especially in the head or neck, I would have a very low threshold to get some sort of advanced imaging, probably a CAT scan, to evaluate for internal injury, both organ and potentially vascular as well. Next injury I want to talk about are mucosal irritants. So this is what we think of when we hear tear gas or pepper spray. These are typically deployed in a liquid or aerosolized form, especially when aerosolized, the idea is to disperse it over a large area to try and disperse people who might be gathered, again, might be engaged in some sort of destructive activity. One thing I found interesting when I was developing this talk is that these mucosal irritants were first developed by the military, but they've actually been banned from use in warfare since 1995. There was a chemical weapons treaty that the United Nations developed that most countries have signed on to, including the United States, that bans the signatories' militaries from using chemical weapons, including mucosal irritants, on the battlefield. Interestingly enough, though, that chemical weapons ban actually had a special provision that still allows countries to use these weapons for the purposes of keeping domestic order. So these weapons have been banned on the battlefield. Countries who have signed on are not allowed to use these weapons against foreign soldiers, but by the terms of the treaty, they are allowed to use them against their own citizens. Make of that what you will. Perhaps it speaks to, I think that's maybe emblematic of the UN as a whole. But just so you're aware, that is the loophole that many countries have to still use these domestically, even though you won't see them on the battlefield. I don't know if anyone here has ever been exposed to pepper spray or tear gas. I know law enforcement and military often will be during their training. Some people have been secondhand exposed or unintentionally exposed. I have. I can tell you it is not fun. Onset is very quick, typically within 20 seconds to a minute after exposure. And really, I mean, to put it bluntly, everything burns and stings. Eye and respiratory irritation is going to be the most common. Your eyes are going to burn. You're going to be tearing. You're not really going to be able to keep your eyes open because it's going to be burning so much. You're gonna feel burning kind of in your mouth, along your down your windpipe for anything that gets down there. You might feel wheezy. You're definitely going to start coughing. Might make it a little hard to breathe while you're exposed. In most cases, symptoms are self-limiting, meaning if you extricate yourself from the exposure, symptoms will resolve, within several minutes to maybe an hour. Bronchospasm, which means kind of constriction of the pipes in your lungs, or pulmonary edema, meaning fluid in the lungs, can occur for individuals who, for whatever reason, have prolonged exposure to these agents. But again, the vast majority of people who are exposed are going to move away or extricate themselves fairly quickly from this. One thing to note on this is that, again, law enforcement typically is the one utilizing these weapons. During some of the Black Lives Matter protests, one thing we did see was some protesters would actually bring leaf blowers to these events to try and actually push the tear gas back onto the law enforcement officials. So again, just because law enforcement is the one utilizing this, they might actually unintentionally become victims if the protesters find some way to push this stuff back onto them. Keep in mind too, especially with tear gas, if it's deployed, it doesn't distinguish. So yes, the protesters will likely be affected. Anyone who happens to be there for any other reason can potentially be impacted as well. For those of you in healthcare, keep in mind, if someone's been exposed and you touch them, then you touch yourself, your face, your eyes, your mouth, guess what? You've just been exposed as well, and you're going to start having a lot of the same symptoms. Very important before you touch these people. I mean, you should always be wearing gloves. To the best of your ability, do some sort of decontamination, even if it's just getting a gallon of water and dumping it over them. It's important to do that to protect yourself. You cannot help anyone if you become incapacitated yourself. Protect yourself, decontaminate. If they're wearing clothes, I would recommend, again, to the best of your ability, depending on where you're practicing, taking off those clothes and sealing them in some sort of bag. Some of this stuff can have delayed release from clothing, excuse me. Again, you don't want to become a secondary victim because you were inadvertently exposed. So very important to properly decontaminate these individuals before you begin treating them. Again, treatment, get them out of the area, decontaminate them to the best of your ability. Ideally, this is happening in the pre-hospital setting via EMS, via fire, who might be responding to something like this. If they haven't, or if there's any sort of doubt when they get to the hospital, you should be washing them out as well. My motto is, if in doubt, meaning if you're not sure if they were decontaminated or not, if in doubt, wash them out. Pretty much every hospital is going to have some sort of decontamination shower. Run them through it if there's any concern. It's not fun. Hopefully they're not wearing nice clothes, but it's important to protect you so that you don't become a victim yourself. On the matter of decontamination, again, some of you guys may remember from some of the protests that we've seen recently, people were bringing milk to these protests as kind of a home remedy for tear gas, pepper spray. There's no evidence out there that milk works any better than just water or saline. There's no evidence that you'll hear a lot of people talk about quote unquote home remedies for this sort of thing. There's no evidence out there that any one liquid works better than any other when it comes to decontamination from this stuff. Eyes need to be irrigated for at least 10 to 20 minutes. In the emergency department, we have these things called Morgan lenses. It's kind of these hard contacts that we stick in people's eyes, and we just hook it up to a bag of fluids and let it run. That way we don't have to sit there and keep washing them out. If you've got those, great. If not, if you have a sink, just turn the water on and put them under it. At least 20 minutes. If the individuals were wearing some sort of contact lens, that's got to go. That's decontaminated, and as long as it's in the eyes, it's going to keep exposing that person to the pepper spray. So definitely get those out. Most symptoms are self-resolving. Again, it's not going to be fun while they're exposed. It's not going to be fun for several minutes to potentially an hour or two afterwards, but most individuals will get better with decontamination, with treatment, and with what we call supportive care. Those with underlying lung disease like asthma or COPD, again, because there is some lung irritation with this, have had worse outcomes. They might require some prolonged monitoring to make sure that they're truly okay from a lung perspective before they go home. Finally, we're going to talk about conducted energy weapons. So this is what we commonly think of when we think of tasers. Something I actually learned, I didn't know this before I developed this talk. Taser actually stands for something. Stands for the Thomas A. Swift electric rifle. Interestingly, Thomas Thomas A. Smith wasn't the guy who invented the taser. He was a fictional character. He was some sort of eccentric inventor, but the individual who developed the taser was a fan of his stories, so named it after him. I just think that's kind of a fun fact, so I share it with you. How a taser works is oftentimes it's these two prongs. They shoot out. They embed in an assailant's or an individual's skin, and it delivers about a 5-second electrical burst when the person pulls the trigger. The idea is this electrical burst causes the muscles in the person's body to very suddenly and very painfully contract. Again, with the idea of incapacitating someone so that they can no longer continue to pose a threat to the law enforcement officer or to whoever's employing the taser. It's a 5-second burst. Again, will cause usually several minutes of kind of contraction, immobility, but as long as the probes are in the person holding the taser can continue delivering shocks by pulling the trigger. So as long as it's in, you can keep delivering shocks by pulling the trigger. It's not a one and done kind of deal. So removing the prongs, we see this not infrequently in the emergency department. People will come in who have been on the wrong end of a taser, who need the prongs pulled out. By and large, they can be largely pulled out. You can see the prongs here don't go very deep. The chances that they're going to hit like an artery or something important is very, very low given how shallow these prongs go. They're sterile. They don't need a tetanus shot afterwards. Again, obviously, if there is any concern that this might be in or near an artery or a nerve, get advanced imaging. But again, the vast majority of these do not need it. I've removed plenty of tasers in my practice. I've never had any concern that it was around anything significant, and I've never had any bad outcome from directly removing a taser from someone. I will say there is a new model of taser out there. It's called the Taser 7, and the manufacturers actually state that you need this special device to take it out. This is something that comes with the cartridge, so the law enforcement officer who brings the individual in with you should have this. And you can see here, it kind of slides in on the bottom, it pulls out, but the manufacturer states that this is the proper way to do it. I get this question all the time, well, what if the cartridge isn't available? What should we do? You know, there's not a good answer to that question. I would say do your best to just pull it out. I think the reason the manufacturers have included this in their instructions is kind of like a liability thing that they have to say. Obviously, you should ask the officer if they have this. Ideally, they should. But if they don't, for whatever reason, I think unfortunately you might have to pull it out. And again, you would just have to document in some way that, you know, you asked, it wasn't available, and you used your best judgment to get the patient, to get the barb out of the patient and to get them on their way. But again, the quote unquote right answer, if you will, and according to the manufacturer, is that you use this removal device that again is part of the cartridge to take it out. So what else is needed? Do patients who have been tased need any sort of lab tests, monitoring? And the answer actually is no. The American Academy of Emergency Medicine several years ago put out a clinical practice statement on this issue. And they say that cardiac monitoring and labs are not routinely indicated for patients who have been tased, who are otherwise healthy and don't have really any significant medical complaint. They do kind of as kind of, again, perhaps they probably put it in there for liability reasons, but they do say patient specific, such as past medical history. So again, if there's any sort of underlying heart disease, should guide treatment decisions. That's kind of a catch-all, just to say, hey, if there's any concern, you can certainly monitor them. You can certainly do labs, but monitoring labs are not routinely indicated just by virtue of being on the wrong end of a taser. So if you've got a patient who's otherwise healthy, who doesn't really have any complaints other than they're probably mad that they've been tased, you can remove the probes from them and send them on their way. So I want to pivot a bit, talk about emergency department considerations during a protest. Again, emergency departments is where I work. It's kind of what I think about when I think about these issues. Some of these issues, though, I think will apply to some of you on this call, even if you don't work in an emergency department. Again, if you're working in some other venue, if you're responding as part of Maryland Responds, a lot of what we're going to talk about kind of crosses specialties, if you will. So first, from an emergency medicine perspective, and again, from other perspectives as well, you need to prepare for an MCI, a mass casualty incident. Now, I will say this picture right here, this is not from an MCI. For those of us who work in emergency departments, you know, this is just kind of our new normal now. Emergency departments, especially in Maryland, are already operating at capacity. Many of us are operating over capacity. We're dealing with boarding. We're dealing with an overtaxed health system, an overtaxed EMS system. That's a normal day for us. When you talk about periods of protest, you're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals who suddenly might all need emergency medical care as a result of whatever injuries they've encountered. Remember, too, protests oftentimes will draw people from surrounding cities, even surrounding states, depending on what it is and why they're there. Many protests come with advance notice, meaning organizers will advertise the event, try and draw people in. In some cases, they'll have to file for permits. Not all of them, obviously. Things that happen in response to like sports games or music festivals, they don't come with a lot of notice, but to the best of your ability, if you know that there's going to be some sort of event in your city, especially if it's a protest, work with your hospital leadership, your law enforcement leadership, again, whatever agency you're with. Start making preparations for a mass casualty incident. It never hurts to be prepared. Best case scenario, the protest is peaceful, nobody gets hurt, everybody goes home after chanting and holding their signs for a little bit. But you need to be prepared for the worst case scenario, which is that your emergency department, your clinic, your whatever, is going to receive an influx of people all needing care from injuries they've sustained. Wherever you are providing care, beware of instigating patients. Protests can sometimes draw counter protests. People don't always get along. People have very passionate beliefs, and they might choose anger, aggression, and maybe even violence to express those beliefs and share them with people on the other side of the protest. People are allowed to have different opinions out on the streets, but again, they pick sides in protests. They don't pick sides when they're seeking medical care. So again, in your emergency department, in your hospital, in your clinic, you might see people who 5 minutes ago were on opposite sides of the picket line, so to speak, who are now sitting in your waiting room together. To the best of your ability, try to separate those people. Keep them in separate areas of the waiting room. If you can, keep them in separate treatment areas. Sometimes you can tell, or a lot of times you can tell which side someone falls on based on signs they might be holding, what they're wearing. It's not always feasible to separate them. To the best of your ability, do so. If you can, I would encourage having increased security in waiting rooms and treatment areas. Again, just to try and deter people from bringing some of their disagreements from the protests into your treatment areas. Protect your emergency department, or again, wherever you're working. You know, protests are mobile. People move around. They might start in one area. They might move to another area, spreading destruction and chaos along the way. Emergency departments, we can't move. We've got four walls and no wheels. So where we are is where we're staying. We need to protect it. We need to stay up to date on where protesters are and which way they're moving. That's going to involve close coordination between EMS, law enforcement, any sort of intelligence agency that's tracking this sort of thing. We need to know where things are, where we need to know where people are. Steps we might need to take are limiting access points. You know, the emergency departments I work in have minimum 2 entrances. An entrance people can walk into from the street, and an entrance ambulance crews can come in. During times like this, you may need to limit that. You might need to say every entrance to the emergency department is closed except this one. Limiting entrances allows you to concentrate security resources. If everyone's coming in through one access point, you can exert much greater control over who is, and more importantly, who isn't coming into your emergency department. You may need to go into lockdown depending on where the protesters are. You might need to say, hey, nobody's coming in or out. Divert ambulances. Again, if you're doing that, that needs to be communicated as quickly as possible to stakeholders in, again, law enforcement, EMS, so that people know, hey, don't come here, it's not safe, we go elsewhere. Ideally, you're working with, your security, both, within your hospital and, again, broader law enforcement, to coordinate security, to try and protect, your space as best you can. Keep in mind, law enforcement and even the National Guard, those aren't beholden to your hospital, they're beholden to the governor. A lot of times, they will be deployed around healthcare resources in recognition of the fact that those are important resources to protect during these times. But again, hospitals don't have control if they get redeployed, they get redeployed. Really, the only security service you have some control over is your hospital or your clinic, or again, whatever agency you're with, your security. So working within your organization to have clear security protocols in place, and ideally to have some way to augment those in a time of protest. Finally, protect your staff. In the hospital, we have shift change. People come and go. They have to drive in, they have to drive out. Again, information needs to be communicated to your staff, both those in the hospital, those outside of it. Hey, which roads are open, which roads are closed. Those are very dynamic situations and can change very quickly. Ideally, that's being communicated to your staff in real time so they know. And honestly, the decision might need to be made to keep everyone locked down and just say, you know what, no one's coming, no one's going in. Hopkins had to do that during the Freddie Gray riots, and they had to bring in, cots, food, things like that, so that the staff could safely remain in the hospital until some of the violence abated and people could safely come and go. It's not ideal to do that, obviously, but it is a decision that might have to be made in the moment. So again, if you're working, if you know that there's going to be some sort of protest or event while you're working, not a bad idea to have a go bag with some essentials, just in case, you have to spend the night. This isn't protest related, but during the early days of COVID, there were concerns that, those of us in the emergency department might have to stay for prolonged periods of time by virtue of lockdowns and various things like that. I had a bag that I kept in my car that had a change of clothes, a toothbrush, my contact lens case, and I think like a small pillow. Again, just small things like that, but in case I had to stay for a prolonged period of time, those are things you're going to want to have. Again, especially in the next several months, depending on certain political things and beyond that, might not be a bad idea for us, and I'm certainly going to have one, to have some sort of go bag available in case we find ourselves unable to leave, where we work due to factors beyond our control. I want to pause now. I have one final slide of just some final thoughts, some take-home points, but I want to pause now to open it up to see if anyone has any questions.
Okay, so we did have some questions. I'm going to go through the chat if you don't mind,
Yeah,
and then I'll take hands that were raised. So just hold tight. I promise I'll get to all of you. So looking at this, let's see. Can the taser affect cardiac activity if delivered to the thorax?
That's a good question. To my knowledge, in patients who are otherwise healthy and not predisposed to any sort of underlying arrhythmia, there haven't been any case reports, again, to my knowledge, of individuals who have suffered some sort of cardiac, abnormality as a result of being on the wrong end of a taser.
Sure.
People who are predisposed to have underlying arrhythmias are at higher risk. Again, I haven't heard of any cases of someone being sent into like ventricular tachycardia, ventricular fibrillation as a result of being tased. That being said, if I have someone who has an underlying arrhythmia, if there was concern that maybe they were tased, quote unquote, in the box, meaning this area of their chest, I would probably keep them for several hours on a cardiac monitor just to make sure.
Gotcha. Next question is kind of twofold. I'm putting two in one for you.
Okay.
Approximately what gauge of needle would the taser needle be, and do the wires detach or do they stay connected to the gun?
That's a good question. I don't know the gauge of the needle, to be completely honest with you. The wires, I think, can detach. I think they detach from the probe end, to be honest. Every time I've seen someone come in who has been who has been tased, the probes are in them, but the wires are not, which makes me think that there is a way for the officers to detach the wire from the probe end.
Okay.
When there is wires and prongs, you have to replace the cartridge, which when you do that, it includes new wires and prongs.
Okay, the next question I'm seeing is, would non-medical professional, i.e. Maryland responders, just refer tased people to the doctors for the removal of the basic taser? And then it says, do the tags themselves hurt if they're no longer being tased?
So to the first question, should you refer them to the doctor? Karen, I would defer to you on that. I'm not sure what Maryland responders are and are not allowed to do.
Okay,
I
so
think,
yeah, typically it is based on your level of credentialing and experience. If you are certified to perform that sort of procedure, i.e. if you are an RN or if you are a physician.
Sure.
But if you are, if you're me and you're a program manager, I'm not pulling,
Sure.
taser,
Yeah.
probes out of someone's arm. That's not going to happen.
Sure. Understandable.
Hopefully that helps.
And I will say too, to anyone on this call, especially to the non-medical people, anything you are not comfortable with, just pass it up. That's why we, nurses, doctors, techs, that's why we're here. Anything you're not comfortable with, tell them. If happens to be a doctor with you in the response, definitely flag us and bring us over. If not, just tell them they have to go to the emergency department. There's nothing wrong with that, and I don't think too many people would fault you for doing that. I certainly would not. To the second half of that question, do the probes hurt? In my experience, and when I say experience, not on the wrong end of it, fortunately. In my patients who have been tasered, the probes don't seem to cause them any sort of discomfort. Even honestly, taking them out doesn't really seem to cause them any sort of discomfort. Usually it's a fairly simple, I just pull it out. A lot of times they don't even bleed because again, they're fairly superficial, and then they just kind of go on their way.
Gotcha. The next question I'm seeing is, where did it go? Oh, what is the effect on patients with a pacemaker?
That is a good question. And to my knowledge, it hasn't been extensively studied. I've never heard of anyone with a pacemaker who has been tased and has had some sort of bad outcome from that, meaning some sort of pacemaker dysfunction or firing or what have you. Again, someone like that, I would not consider quote unquote low risk. And it is probably someone I would at the very least keep on a monitor and monitor them for several hours, if not overnight. And I would have a much lower threshold to kind of send labs on them, including some cardiac labs, just to make sure there was no sort of damage. Again, to my knowledge, there has been no case report of something bad like that happening, but it is something that I wouldn't feel as comfortable or as confident just saying, okay, you're fine, go home, because again, that person is at higher risk.
Sure, gotcha. Okay, so let's move into hands that are raised. Who do I see? Ann Manley, you have a question?
Yes, I have been concerned about the kettling of protesters, which happened in September of 2017 in St. Louis, which is where I'm from, and the injuries that resulted because of the kettling. Not only were innocent people drawn in and actually told to go into the kettle, but then, there's just a recent lawsuit settlement where the undercover officer who was beat up received a settlement. And I had read at the time that had been done before in Seattle. And I just saw it happen now, a few weeks ago with the student protesters. Yep. The one that I was particularly alarmed by was the University of Texas at Austin, where the protesters, students on campus, were encircled by the state riot police. And the injuries I witnessed when I saw the real-time photos in the news, which were later deleted, were atrocious.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were dragging people by their extremities who had been zip tied upside down and backwards. And
mm-hmm.
My arms and shoulders and wrists are still hurting because I saw that picture. I can't unsee it.
Mm-hmm.
That was taken down. And I think that the kettling tactic is especially dangerous, because then I guess it gets the officers to think, well, they've got to arrest everyone in the circle and no one's allowed to escape. No one can change their mind. They can't
Yep.
leave. They're trapped.
Mhm.
That just escalates the whole situation. So I was wondering if we could, focus on prevention and tell law enforcement, you don't need to kettle protesters. You don't need to encircle them. You don't have to arrest every single person who happens to be in that circle. Let them go.
Yeah, look, I'm not a law enforcement professional. I think there probably is room to engage on those issues. Again, I'm not trying to take sides here. I think that unfortunately, again, as we see more of this across, the political spectrum, across a variety of ideologies and across a variety of issues, not just law enforcement, but those of us in the medical system, those of us in community engagement, I think a lot of us are going to have to figure out what quote unquote best practices are for interacting, engaging with, protesters, counter protesters, and even just members of the community who happen to be walking by. I agree with you. A lot of the footage has been, very disturbing. I think that, again, I don't think it's my role to say what is or isn't proper in terms of law enforcement tactics as someone who has never worked in law enforcement. But again, I do think there is an opportunity for more dialogue on this issue and the development of best practices, again, across all domains, across all disciplines, so that when these events happen, and again, I think it's a matter of when, not if, we see more and more and larger protests domestically, we as a system, and again, a healthcare system, a law enforcement system, even a state system or a regional system, depending on how big these events are, can respond in a coordinated way that maximizes both the public safety, because that is important as well, but also, individual safety and health.
Right, and to de-escalate rather than escalate.
Sure.
And handling and circling the protesters, I think it will only escalate. I mean, if the governor has ordered it and you're just following orders, that's a problem too.
No, it's a very tough issue. I wish I had a better answer for you. I don't know what the quote unquote right answer is to that question, but I do think the first step to answering that question is an awareness from all of us that, hey, yeah, we need to find the best way to deal with these issues. And again, getting the right people, the right training. I like to think that this is a part of that. It's admittedly a very small part of that. But hopefully, by talking about this today, we can all go back to, again, whatever group, agency, whatever we work with, and again, engage some of our colleagues in those conversations so that when these issues happen, we are all in the best position to support everyone, be it law enforcement, be it protesters who come to us seeking our help.
Okay, Bill Dussault, do you have a question? Mr. Dussault, if you unmute yourself, you can ask your question. Okay, anybody else with a question? Oh, you're back. Let's see. Is their last name Tavins? Okay. All right. So I'm trying. If you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask it.
No.
Yes. How are responders distinguished from protesters?
That is a great question. Do you mean Maryland responders, or just Maryland Respond members, or just responders in general?
Us, the people you're fielding. I don't want to be thought of as a protester.
Yeah.
But sometimes police don't make distinctions unless it's very plain.
Police don't make distinctions, and like I said, things like tear gas doesn't make distinctions either.
That's true. But do we get a jacket?
What'd you say?
A vest saying emergency responder.
Yep.
We
And
do.
I believe so. Karen, correct me if I'm wrong. I do believe you get some sort of identifier, and I think it is a vest.
Yes, there are MRC vests as well as identification badges that indicate your level of expertise and your credentialing.
So,
Wonderful.
so look, yes, you do have that identification. I will say there have been instances, again, we saw a decent amount in some of the Black Lives Matter protests where EMS personnel, were injured, most commonly through some sort of mucosal irritant, but received other injuries as well by virtue of operating in close proximity to the protesters. And it's a balance, right? Emergency medical care, one of the tenets is timeliness, right? The sooner you can get to someone, the better in terms of their outcome. Unfortunately, if that person's in the middle of a protest in a protest group, and how do you maximize getting to that person, potentially pushing your way through crowds of potentially violent individuals, getting them out, all while wondering what happens if I'm in the middle of this group when law enforcement decides that to deploy tear gas. Again, similar to the previous question, there is no good answer to that question. Security and reaching personal security and delivering medical care to someone expeditiously in this situation is a trade-off. Maximizing one inherently comes at the expense of the other. And it's similar to some of the other things we talked about earlier. The emergency department, our motto is to remain open and accessible to the public. If we start closing down entrances, and especially if we go into lockdown, we in a way violate that core tenet of our identity. Some of these trade-offs have to be made in times like this. And again, and this might sound like a cop-out, I'm not trying to be. There is no good answer to that question. People who are much smarter than me and who have spent a lot more time thinking about this than I have spilled a lot of ink about what the right answer is. To your question, I would say in a situation like that, use your best judgment. If you think that a situation is unsafe, if you don't feel that you could be safe operating in close proximity to, some sort of event like that, I would say don't. If you're concerned that, if you're near something that, if law enforcement might utilize some sort of modality like tear gas, kinetic impact projectiles, whatever, and you're worried that you might be near that, move yourself away. Again, realizing that the trade-off is you might not be in the best position to help those who are injured. But if the flip side of that is you might be coming, look, I personally am a big believer in maximizing personal safety above all else. I did take a code when I entered this profession, but I did not take a code to be tear gassed or take a beanbag bullet to the face for anyone. People might feel differently, and people do feel differently. Some of my colleagues feel differently. Some of my colleagues have volunteered, on their own time without any sort of organizational affiliation to go to these protests in plain clothes and just be there as a resource in case someone gets injured. All the power to them. That's great. But they are doing that. In doing that, they are potentially exposing themselves to that risk. Fortunately, no one I knew personally was injured. But that's a risk that they knew and that they took. I can't tell you what the right answer is for you, but it is a very real concern that, especially if you're operating in the pre-hospital setting, you're going to have to be aware of. And I think it's great that you're thinking about it. And to everyone on this call, I would encourage you to think about, where is that line for you? How close are you willing to get? What exposure, how much exposure are you willing to take on? And that's a question that we all need to think about and we all need to answer before we potentially respond to one of these things.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions. If your question has not been answered yet, please feel free to put it in the chat, and I will work with Dr. Jasani to get it answered and send you responses to all of your questions that didn't get a chance to get answered. So let's go with Ryan Marie.
Hey guys, thank you so much for presenting. I just had a quick question regarding how close are we allowed to get to the back of a police line? So are we allowed, if we see someone down, police don't offer or render first aid, can we grab a reeve sleeve and drag them out once the line has passed? Or does this go to your first question of saying that we should not get as close to them without assuming personal risk.
Mhm. You know, and keep in mind, law enforcement's charge is not to render aid. So a lot of times they won't, because that's just not their mission. And you know, so yeah, I would say if you're going to do something like that, you need to be coordinating with law enforcement who are there, so that if they see you, you know, running up or behind their line, they know why. Again, that should be done in very close coordination with them. Definitely don't just take it. I would advise you anyway not to take it upon yourself just to run up without having told any of them, because in a situation like that where everyone's stressed, where everyone's on edge, if law enforcement sees someone running at them or running behind them, you know, they might just assume the worst. Which, you know, I mean, again, not to pass judgment, but it could happen. Again, yes, this gets to whatever risk you're feeling comfortable with, but if you do want to render that aid, I would just ask that you notify, you know, your law enforcement colleagues that you are going to be doing that before you do it, so that there's no unintended consequences of that.
Great.
Yeah, I respect that. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Of course.
Okay, one more question. Kathleen Shannon.
Thank you. Can you see a need for medical professionals who are also in MRC to be deployed to a hospital ED or maybe adjacent during something like this?
I think so, because again, in something like this, we are probably going to see an influx of patients. I think doctors, I think nurses, I think techs, absolutely. Keep in mind, a lot of hospitals, as part of their kind of quote unquote MCI plans, will be trying to call in off-duty staff. And so it's a question of, are you going to deploy with MRC, or are you just going to get called into your own hospital where you normally work? I think that, you know, if MRC does it again, it needs to be done in coordination with the hospital. So MRC isn't calling us and our hospital isn't calling us at the same time. But yeah, I think there's definitely a need. I think any way to augment emergency medical capacity during periods like this should definitely be explored.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question. Maria Escuela. Okay, maybe not.
All right.
So I would encourage anyone who still has questions to please feel free to put them in the chat. I will leave it up for a little bit. And then Dr. Jasani, I'll let you close it out.
Yeah.
Sorry, did you like to add? I just found my mute button.
Oh,
Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So I have to admit that I redline on the documentation that goes along with recording calls and injuries, but I was wondering if there are any guidelines that we have or understandings that we have with law enforcement and others as far as how to code this, what we record as part of the patient's narrative for that record, for, you know, where they were, you know, who they were with, what happened, what the injuries looked like, what, you know, how they were treated, what the outcomes were, and that kind of thing. And that how quickly do we need to be pulling these records together and aggregating them for who gets to request this. But I know that it, you know, having been engaged in civil disobedience and also being in EMS now, it's so easy to lose people. And so knowing where people are and how they're being moved or who they're released to is all really important. The other thing that I was concerned about was, you know, I would hope that everybody on, you know, whatever side of the dispute would be able to recognize the medical responders and so
Yeah.
I don't know if there's any of that standardization or training going on anywhere.
Yeah, yes, ideally, you know, protesters would respect the medical, you know, mission. You know, we did see some instances in, again, some of the BLM protests. You know, EMS and law enforcement uniforms can be very similar depending on the jurisdiction. There were some instances where EMS officials were harassed, and I think in some cases even attacked because they were mistaken for law enforcement. you know, a lot of the patches and stuff look very similar. Some of the uniforms can be misconstrued. Unfortunately, that does happen. So while ideally, yes, the medical mission would be respected, that doesn't always happen. Again, just for everyone's situational awareness. As to your question about records, yes, that can get very challenging. You know, MCIs a lot of times, certainly in the hospital, and I think EMS too, we revert to paper charting just by virtue of the influx of patients, the inability to kind of be tied to a computer. Yes, collecting that information and more importantly, keeping it is very challenging and is definitely something to think about, as opposed to how quickly you need to document or where it goes. I would defer to Karen on that. But yes, a very real challenge and something to be aware of.
Okay, so we are officially out of time. Did you want to share your last slide and then we will go ahead and wrap this up?
Yep. So thank you everyone for those questions. Those were great. And again, if we didn't get a chance to answer it, Karen can send them my way. But just final thoughts: weapons employed during periods of protest, while quote unquote non-lethal, can still cause some pretty severe injuries. These protests present a host of challenges, both to us, you know, in the field and to emergency departments and hospitals as well. And we need to be aware of those and, to the best of our ability, take steps to mitigate those on an individual and a systems level. And again, we can protest in our own time. Maybe some of us have. When we're working, our role is to treat. And we need to do that to the best of our ability, regardless of how we may feel about the individual or the cause that he or she represents. So again, everyone, thank you. It was a pleasure for a fantastic discussion. This is my email if anyone wants to email me offline. Conversely, you can email Karen and she has my email and can reach out to me as well. So again, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. Keep in mind, we did record this and we will be sending